Okay, I'd like to welcome the fabulous Moty Cristal. Hello, my friend. Thank you for spending time
Hey
with
Noah, how
me.
are you?
Moty is an international expert in complex negotiations and crisis management. I'm very lucky to have his time today. And I want to ask you questions, Moty, about what sort of concepts, ideas, tactics, strategies we can adopt for business negotiations from your background in political, international, diplomatic negotiations. Okay?
Yeah, sure. That's a common question because people believe that negotiation is a general concept which is applied the same in different contexts. And actually, I believe exactly the opposite. Negotiation is a set of skills, a way of thinking, a profession which must be applied completely different, depends on the context. And for many, many years, the business negotiation people, the scholars who led business negotiations from the Harvard, Roger Fisher getting to yes, to his disciples and generation after, kept a complete separate, I would say, scholarly line of work from the people who developed the concept of international negotiation. The most known is William Zartman and the concept of ripeness and mutually hurting stalemate. These two concepts hardly interacted. I would say, working with both of them many, many years ago, they actually didn't really appreciate each other, but this changed. This changed the more negotiation, the thinking became deeper and deeper and understood, like scholars and practitioners really understood that by the end of the day, as I said, it's not a policy or an ideology or a field of work. It's just a set of skills which needs to be applied to the relevant context. What could be applied from business negotiation to political negotiations? First of all, the understanding of the complexity and the stakeholders mapping. People tend to think mistakenly that the person with whom you negotiate is just your counterpart across the table. And that's not the case. You have to, both in politics, in diplomacy, and in business, you need to explore the stakeholders mapping. You need to understand who are the real decision maker. Like in business negotiation, sometimes the person whom you talk is definitely not a decision maker, and the lady who sits in the corner of the negotiation table, she's actually the most important person because she's the daughter, the trusted daughter of the main shareholder, and you should address your ideas actually to her or take her into consideration. The same in political negotiations. Sometimes the person whom you think is completely the irrelevant person, he is the trusted advisor of the minister, of the prime minister. So identify the scene and define the stakeholders is something that we can apply on both political and diplomatic, political and business negotiation. The second is, of course, the human interaction. This is, I think, the most common denominator in any negotiations, be it crisis, hostage, business, diplomacy. The fact that you have to profile, once you identify the overall stakeholder mapping, you need to profile the person with whom you negotiate. Identify his or her own negotiation pattern is something which is common. I would say that the major difference between business negotiation and political negotiation is that most of the time in business negotiations, yes, you understand the interest, etc., but most of the time in business negotiations, you can define a quantifiable ZOPA, a zone of possible agreement, which could be quantified with the price range or set of issues, or I would say the financial value of an interaction in business negotiations. In political or diplomatic negotiation, you cannot do that. By the way, take a look at Trump negotiating with Ukraine. Many people believe that it is political or diplomatic negotiation, but from Trump perspective, it's a minerals deal negotiation. But yet, despite the fact that he looked at it, how can U.S. take advantage of Ukraine natural resources and try to compare it. He said it publicly. Try to compare it to the already military aid U.S. invested in Ukraine. By the end of the day, the factor of national pride, national interest, which could not be quantified, I would say the national psyche of the national psyche of a country, take Ukraine or take Israel, countries that are under threat. These are things which you actually cannot really quantify. And you have to be much more sensitive and much more open-minded in order to be able to factor in these non-quantifiable elements. I would like to emphasize, it's not that in business negotiations there are not intangible factors. There is anger, envy, sense of humiliation, but a sensitive and skillful negotiator in business negotiation can identify this non-material interest and address them, not through financial compensation, but through personal attention, through acknowledgement, through recognition. But by the end of the day, the big difference between business and political is the fact that business negotiation could be quantified and the zone of possible agreement is much easily identified than in diplomatic and political negotiations.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up Trump because that's the perfect example of a mix between a political, diplomatic style of negotiations or aims in negotiation with business aims in the negotiation.
I fully agree. And, to some extent in political conversation, in diplomatic conversation, Trump is perceived, I would say, definitely in the negotiation sphere by those who invented the Harvard concept and the win-win, is perceived as a bully, as an aggressive, as a confrontational. And I would say carefully that in our realistic world, changing dynamics, overriding concepts of power, which some extent I can see why in New Zealand it's too far to see it. But in the crazy world we live in, you cannot and you should not rule out the Trump principles of instrumental, coercive, confrontational negotiation. If we say that negotiation is neither a policy nor an ideology, and you don't come to pursue liberal value or democratic value through negotiations, but rather negotiation is an instrument to pursue your own interest, you have to include in your negotiation toolbox also elements or tools or attitudes which are more confrontational, more what the Harvard people call distributive, rather than cooperative methods. It's a must, because if you don't do that, you go, with a limited toolbox.
Right. And it seems to me from how I observe my clients that people think of a negotiation as just what's happening at the table, whereas Trump is exemplifying what it means to have a pre-negotiation stage where you increase your power or you better your position before you come to the table using these hardball tactics.
I fully agree, Noah, and our role as negotiation teacher, consultant, or people who supports negotiation processes, advise on negotiation processes, it's our responsibility, exactly as you said, to widen the scope of the negotiation. Negotiation is what we call the positioning, the stage during which you find leverages, you increase your bargaining power, you improve your BATNA, you profile the other thing. It's the pre. It's not only the tactical preparation on the content, but rather the overall positioning, an essential element which brings you much more powerful to the
Yeah.
negotiation table. And in public negotiation, it includes also influence, media, campaigns, things like that, that makes the other side actually believe that you have more power, you have more alternatives
Yeah.
to the
I
negotiation.
100% agree. And in the last few years, I've been focusing more and more on how to create the right narrative before getting to the table, how to use influence tactics, and how to set the stage for the negotiation in the best way. And so you said a few things that all tie together. You said, mapping of stakeholders is something that you do in political negotiations, but I'm assuming that when it comes to diplomatic negotiations, some of the players and some of the agendas are hidden. And so you would have to do a lot more research and you have a lot more of a contextual acumen to understand what the interests are once you've mapped. And wait, before you speak, I have to say to whoever's listening that Moty Cristal is the expert in systems thinking when it comes to negotiations. So you are the perfect person to comment on this.
Well, I like this comment, and I think that I wish in today's completely open and exposed reality, I wish there were hidden agendas. The fact that almost nothing today is secret and hidden, and everything is exposed and everything is on the social media, and you can definitely track people's, and definitely diplomats or political leaders, you can track their agendas, their links, their relationships. It's all there. So
But
I
they won't
would
tell you. You have to research.
you have to research. Exactly. You have to research. And that goes back to what exactly you said about preparing for the negotiation. If you think that you prepare for the negotiation only through the content, know what you want and what are the issues to discuss, no. One of the things that I think more than a decade persuaded my clients to do is definitely before the era of ChatGPT, is to hire a smart student who will serve as your research assistant and actually will dig. In the past, it was much more challenging. You had sometimes to use human intelligence, which means that you have to interview people before the negotiations and learn about the dynamics. But today, with the all open sources and the use of smart use of ChatGPT, critical use of ChatGPT and AI tools, I would say almost that there are hardly any secrets and hardly any hidden agenda to the extent that you cannot discover them. There's basically it's endless, the time and the resources that you can invest in researching. But you need to limit it. You need to limit it to the operational minimum, which you set in advance. I want to know who is Noah, how is she, who are the people who influence her, all this type of info, what is she really wants, and they are open source resources. They are your listening devices, not chips, your listening device. You come to the meeting with Noah and you ask an open question and said, "Hey, Noah, how are you? What is that you really want?" And then you shut up and then you listen. And then usually the first thing that a person says is what he or she really, really wants. Because most of us are not good actors in negotiations. So just listen to people, and they will tell you a lot of the things which you didn't discover in your online research.
So beyond researching the people at the table or the decision makers, and beyond asking the right questions at the table, what is it, or are there any things that international political negotiators do exceptionally well that business negotiators often overlook?
I don't know. I don't really think highly of diplomatic and political negotiators.
Well, I'll give you an example. There's a lot that I'm assuming that when you were involved in international negotiations, you had a strategy towards media, or you were thinking about the audiences involved in the negotiation, and you had a strategy around that. Whereas when I observe business negotiations, there's not so much
I
effort put into that.
Yeah, well, that's I agree. The diplomats and political negotiators are much more aware of the public element, the media, the narrative, as you mentioned, more than business negotiator, let alone the lawyers. The lawyers are completely focusing on the language and the formalities.
Mhm.
But I would say a talented businessman or woman who lives in, I would say, a publicly traded company, which means that they are aware of the public narrative and the influence of rumors and news on the share price. Those people, when they come to the negotiation table, they are aware of the public elements. Diplomats and political figures leave the public sphere and the public elements and the narrative much more than the business people. However, I would say generally, okay, I don't want to be too cynical. The downside of diplomats or political negotiators compared to business people is that they attribute a much higher importance to moral and values. Okay? For business people, moral is the money and the values is the share price. But for diplomats, definitely liberal and countries or democracies, they believe that once they negotiate it, they not only need to pursue their country's interest, but they also need to pursue the global morals or ethics, which is something significantly less with business people.
And do you think that that is because those intangible, we'll call it procedural or principle related interests are important to them inherently? Or do you think that they're doing this because they're having negotiations behind the table with the people that, with the public, let's say, or with their voter base in order to support them?
Neither. I think that, but I will rely to the latter, to the second point you mentioned. I think that the reason is still the cultural or the group DNA. When you go to the foreign service or when you grew up in the political system, the overall attitude or the DNA, the environment in which you grew up professionally is that you came to the service of the public, to serve a common good, a global or a national cause. You come to the public service,
Mhm.
while in business, you come to pursue
Individual
business
service.
goals, the shareholders' interest. So I think that's and young people, young professionals who come and do their first steps in diplomatic corps, or they do the first step in business school or global corporate, they developed in a different DNA or different cultural environment, which definitely affect their negotiation behaviors. Now, what you mentioned, it's interesting because it's one of the most significant challenges in negotiation, and it's called behind the scenes, behind the table negotiation, not behind the scene, behind the table. Because most of the people, and you saw it many times in your work as a consultant, that you are called to support a negotiation because they think that they have a problem with the other side, but actually most of your effort is to support the client dealing with their own internal dynamics, be it different ministries or negotiating with the public, or in the business, they negotiating with the CFO or the legal counsel. So behind the table negotiations, compared to across the table negotiations, a framework which was developed many years ago at Harvard, I believe that behind the table negotiation is equally challenging, both in political and in business negotiations. And I also know from my experience that behind the table negotiations requires much more energy and attention, definitely more than you planned. And the reason is because when you come to the negotiation, you work under the assumption that the main enemy or the counterpart is actually the other side, and you expect support from your party members, from your government colleagues, or from your management colleagues, the other people on the C level, and this not happens. The different ministers, different political parties have different agendas, the same as the CFO and the legal advisor and the head of marketing. Each one of them have different agenda, which not necessarily is your interest or your prioritizing of interest or your agenda when it comes to external negotiations.
I want to ask you about power asymmetry. We still have time, right?
Yeah, that's nice. Power asymmetry. I love power asymmetry.
Yeah, so it's a big factor in both political and business negotiations. And international negotiations, you've often got the weaker parties and the stronger parties. What strategies have you seen used effectively to rebalance the power? And what can we borrow for business negotiations when dealing with, say, major suppliers or large clients?
I would say that the concept of power in negotiation, definitely within, I would say, the Harvard methods, is probably one of the most significant issues in negotiation that is downplayed and left outside. For me, when I come to the negotiation table, I look at three things first of all. One is the power structure. Am I the powerful or am I the powerless? And power in negotiation has nothing to do with resources, with hierarchy, with formal status. Power in negotiation comes, or you get your power in the negotiation only from two sources: information. Do you have more information? Do you have more knowledge than the other side? And alternatives. If you have better alternatives, or if your cost of no deal is lower than the cost of no deal of the other side, you have more power. This is why this is the first thing I look. I'm like, first, in parallel, one eye I look at the stakeholders mapping, and the second eye I look at the power structure. And if you understand that you have no alternatives, that the cost of no deal is very high for you, which means that you must have the deal, Zelensky compared to Trump, okay? Or negotiating with a single source supplier, okay? Or negotiating with your wife. When you have no alternative, when your cost of no deal is very, very high, you are the powerless. And it is extremely important to acknowledge that to yourself. Let me tell you a secret. People hate to feel powerless in life, let alone in negotiations. So the fact that I do the analysis, I understand that my cost of no deal is very, very high. This is a shocking experience. And most of the people, when they realize that, no, they do the terrible mistake and they play as they have the power. No. Zelensky in the Oval Office had to understand, and his people were forced to prepare him. Who's Trump? And by the end of the day, Ukraine cannot rely on France and UK. Ukraine in the war, in its war with Russia, relied only on the US. So the cost of no deal of Zelensky is extremely high. Mm-hmm. And in his performance in the Oval Office, he didn't act as he didn't have the power. That was his tactical mistake. And of course, Trump and J.D. Vance showed him actually what is the real thing. So first, you understand the power balance. Second, you do the stakeholders mapping. The third element, I will come back to power in a second. The third thing that you look, which is, again, many times neglected, is the concept of time. And you ask yourself at the beginning of the negotiation, does time work in my favor? Or does time works against me? Which means if I will prolong the negotiations, will I be more powerful or I will lose?
And
If I do a quick negotiation, that's once you have these three elements, you can then come to the design table and think to what extent you can negotiate, or what should be your negotiation strategy, or negotiation, what should be your negotiation strategy? And if you are the powerless, don't play as you have the power. There are several strategies which we will not go into it. We will need to meet. I will need to meet your students, and we'll see.
So you said there are two sources of power, information and alternatives, and there's another element of time. So when it comes to political negotiations, I would think that alliances play a big role, but you're saying that that falls under either alternatives or sources of information.
No, I think alliances, I'm smiling because alliances is one of the strategies of weak parties. Coalitions, once you understand that you're the weak party, that you're the powerless, one of the main strategies which you can use in order to equate the table is to build coalitions, either build coalitions with other powerless parties. The best example is, I'm sure that you have it in New Zealand, the Association of Pharmaceutical Companies, or the Association of Banks, or why? Because each one of the banks, despite the fact that they are very, very powerful corporates and entities, but each one of the banks, when they come to negotiate with the regulators, with the government, they are weak. But if there's a union of banks or the Association of Pharmaceutical Companies, now they have a significant power vis-a-vis the government. This is why they form a coalition. And that's a classic example where powerless parties actually build a coalition in order to equate the table with more powerful actors. This is one of the strategies.
Okay. Moty, thank you so much. Where can people listening learn more about your work? Because they should.
Google Moty Cristal with the right spelling, and probably there are some open source, there are some writings, and a lot on the web has to do with my night job, which is negotiating with cyber criminals. It's a fascinating. We were doing some work on that together, Noah. So and some of the talks describe this magnificent and fascinating world of negotiating with cyber criminals, which captures a lot of the things that we discussed. The lack of alternatives, being powerless, using human dynamics in order to steer the negotiation towards in your favor. So there are a lot of resources, and I think that the most important thing is that I have to come and teach a little bit there in New Zealand, distance myself from the crazy Middle East.
Yes, we'll have to arrange something. Thank you so much.